Om Satyena Labhyastapasa Hyesa Atma Samyag Yanena Brahmacharyena Nityam Antaha Sharirehi Jyotirmayo Hi Shubhraha Yam Pashanti Yatayaha Kshinadoshaha Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. The Atman, the indivisible, all-pervasive self, in all beings and in all things, is realized by moderation, by knowledge, by austerity, and by veracity. All of these constantly cultivated. When mental impurities dissolve due to this practice, then the seer beholds it everywhere, existing in everything, even here in this very life, mind, and body. Om, peace, peace, peace. May that Brahman protect us, may it sustain us, and may it illumine our thinking consciousness. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, and with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om, peace, peace, peace. Peace be unto us and peace be unto all. Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Tat Sat. Welcome to what may be the penultimate class on this series called Adhikara Vichara. That is basically qualification that we're trying to get in all the teachings of Mother India. That's a tall order because, as we've seen by the last 4 classes, we've gone through only 3 darshanas in all that time and studied and cited certain points about them, brought out facets about not only the philosophy, also the way to walk it on the path, and also the founders of those great systems, specifically Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta, the non-dual leaning set of India's darshanas. Today we want to break away from that, although much more could be said about it all, and go toward the Tantra leaning philosophies, such as Tantra itself and Kundalini Yoga, and maybe kind of round it off with some teachings by Yoga Vishishta next week, that is, out of Yoga Vishishta by Lord Vishishta, this ancient rishi who is the teacher of the teenage avatar Sri Ramchandra way back before Krishna. So we're getting a very deep and long look at, not only through time, but at these great systems that you might say prove themselves by their longevity. If they've been around for thousands of years, even before the Christ era, as they call it, and even before Buddha, who is probably the new kid on the block amongst all of these darshanas, then you can know that they're dependable and they're time-tested, and that you can rely upon them to guide the soul back to the enlightenment, which is always in its possession, but that it tends to forget sometimes when it comes to play in the fields of the Lord. That is, when it takes on a name and a form in time and space and begins to accrue karma, that's where you know that the yugas have advanced or are advancing, and people are beginning to forget, unfortunately, their deep contact with divine reality. Call it God, Brahman, Allah, Yahweh, Pragyaparam, as Buddha called it. And therefore, that forgetfulness begins to take over. Well, I've done a whole series of classes on that alone. Vismriti, the dire effects of forgetfulness of one's true nature. And we know that Daiva Smriti is the opposite of that. That belongs to these beings who who remember their divine existence and who have transcended not only negative karmas, but probably gone beyond their good karmas too, because good karma, as is taught by some of these darshanas, is more like a gold chain. As Vivekananda said, a gold chain will bind as fast as much as an iron chain. So we want to strike off all those fetters, as he said in his Song of the Sannyasin, bonds that bind thee down of shining gold or darker baser ore. So he's talking about gold and iron there as a metaphor for these good and bad karmas that come on to people. One of our assistant teachers, Annapurna Sharda, last week in her class showed that chart by Lord Vashishta, how beings come out of Brahman free of cause and effect. They're called Jivan Muktas. And then they just live one lifetime without accruing any karma. And then they pass back inwards to Brahman and merge themselves like a hailstone into an ocean. As Shankara says, that boundless expanse of pure conscious awareness called Brahman, with its swell of the nectar-like Atman, into which my mind fell like a hailstone falling into the sea, placed me in a state of non-dual ecstasy. So he quotes beautiful things like that out of his own scripture, Vivekachudamani. He's not just an avatar of Shiva, but he was also a composer of many, many scriptures, all of them of Vedantic variety, but tinged and tasted with Tantra, which we'll look at today, as I was just saying. So the whole point of this is that we're trying to qualify ourselves by hearing the truth. And some of us have done that. And now, as one article in our next issue of Nectar of Non-Dual Truth puts it, has our practice given rise to any transformation? Are we looking back over 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 in the case of my guru, years of practice and commitment, and are we seeing transformation of mind taking place? Of course, we'll have to have some sort of memory again of what we were like in our teens and 20s. In America, maybe we don't want to go there. But the important part is how far we've come and how far we've traveled along that path, and then how much character we've built. And that can also be gauged by how few bonds we have around us still. If our mind still is thinking about divine reality after all this time, maybe even more intensely than when it started the path, because that intensity of starting along the path sometimes is attended by naivete and by hope and by maybe some enthusiasm that was based more on attachment than on an expectation. So we probably want to look at the progress that we've made along the path based on how many years, hopefully decades, we've been in it. And so this is why qualification of oneself is important. It's not, or maybe put it this way, it's a very high ideal, maybe too much to expect that people in this day and age would be born with parents and ancestors and with gurus right next door, like in the old days of India, or right up the street or on the mountaintop or cave nearby, and could go there and ask all the questions that came with them when they came into the body and when they saw this world and this projected world with all its allurements and with its obstacles and impediments and with the possibility of making many errors and accruing karma and then having to attenuate it. Maybe all of that was not possible for these Jivan Muktas who came straight out of Brahman, lived one lifetime, and went back into Brahman without accruing any karma. So it's a very beautiful teaching that's very ancient in India, to put in front of us this ideal of freedom with a capital F. That is, one of Swamiji's most favorite words in English was freedom. And he passed away on 4th of July, I think, sort of symbolic of the fact that he was always in freedom when he lived, and he was always exemplifying to us the need to seek freedom from bondage, bonds that bind thee down. So in this way, we've been looking over the last 4 weeks at 3 darshanas, 3 paths of clear seeing. Samkhya, with Lord Kapila and what he contributed to India's ancient philosophy, if we could want to call it that, a combination of religion and philosophy and spiritual experience. And then we looked at Father of Yoga, this Patanjali, and his 8-limb system, called Raja Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga. So that's that authentic yoga that we want to hear more of in this day and age, which transcends the need to, or maybe the tendency to think that we can find freedom just through physical exercises or through regimens of fasting and energy control and so forth. All of that is at the lower level of yoga, but you still need to pass on to the upper limbs and climb the whole tree and get this experience of samadhi that they also call nirvana in other schools. And in that way, then, we looked at Vedanta, whose major preoccupation is with that non-dual freedom. It's less of a practice and more of a statement of truth or fact, philosophical fact, that this self is always one with Brahman. Atma, Brahma, they're one and the same. And the jiva is also Shiva, if you want to put it in the tantric way, which we do want to put it today in the tantric way. We can, as having reminded you of the last several classes that we took up with those 3 darshanas, again, this is how we're qualifying ourselves. When we hear later about India's teachings, we should be able to peg, oh, that sounds like it came from yoga, or that sounds like it came from Vedanta, or that sounds like a teaching from Lord Kapila in Sankhya. He's talking about tattvas and how the transmigrating soul gets into form and worlds, and how it gets out of that also when it wants to return to its source. All as easy as you please, because of this pure conscious awareness that it's always remembering. So with those 3 darshanas having been presented to us, and hopefully we qualifying ourselves in more and more of that, because we've shown them before, and Vedanta, of course, is our major umbrella here, with Swami Vivekananda bringing it to the West, then we want to leave off from last week and go on to take up some of these great principles that are tantric in essence, like there were 2 rivers flowing side by side, and one was more leaning towards the non-dual truth via philosophy, and one was more leaning towards worship and deification via God with form. And those 2 have been mingling their waters all along, and they both look at yoga with great respect and know it to be the ultimate practice. If yoga means, of course, union, but it can also be the best darshana to take up for a practice. And so we left off last week with this idea or this principle of darshanas and their essence being one. So that's a good way to segue into what we want to talk about now as being Tantra. So you can see this great saying. I won't go through it all again because you've seen it last week. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. The goal is one, paths leading to it are many, if you want to say it in that way. The essence of all religions are one, as Sri Ramakrishna found out, but the religions themselves they have their own paths and their own ways of reaching the foot of the mountain. So that's the gist of this whole chart that we looked at. And we read the various quotes from the Upanishads, and of course consulted the paragon of universality, who has come on the scene just fairly recently in this yuga in our lives, just before we were born, Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and how they presented this ideal of universality to us. So we went to that chart after having seen Samkhya, Yoga, and Vedanta as this triputi of philosophies that grew out of one another and back into one another and corroborated each other's teachings over not just centuries but millennia. And the only thing we didn't take up in this chart, and it's a good way to acquaint us back to this idea of how the seeking mind wants to qualify itself, Atma Vichara and so forth, wants to qualify itself with this idea of universality as a pat truth behind it. It's a foundation that's irrevocable, akshara. It's indestructible. It's the foundation upon which everyone wants to proceed when they try and qualify themselves. And unfortunately, in conventional religion, it's missing, because you're focusing hopefully the focused eye of this laser-like consciousness that you have on just one path alone. But there's a way in which we can, as Krishna says, open the inner eye of wisdom and then look out upon the whole world and its various races and cultures and traditions and pathways, and absorb it all like you would absorb one air, in one lungful of air when you breathe in. And get all the different fragrances in the air, you see, and be nourished by your breathing process. It's very much like the pranayama exercise you want to do, that wants to connect itself to inward, towards not just body, senses, food, but beyond that, to the prana and the thoughts, the psychic prana that conducts your thoughts. All breathe, take a big healthy breath of this philosophy of non-duality we're talking about. Because remember, we started off from that after we finished looking at Samkhya, Yoga, and Vedanta, and we quickly went to this Advaitic teaching that includes more than just non-duality as a philosophy in it, but it includes universality with Sri Ramakrishna in it. And that's what he's added to the whole mix, if you will. When he came into the body and we saw him seeking God through these different religious paths and finding God in all of them. It was that essence that he found. And it wasn't just stumbling upon it by accident. In the case of one or two of them that just were indigenous to India, he actually went looking for it amongst religions from other countries, and found that same essence in them all, and had insight and visions of the founders of those religions too, Middle Eastern religions, for instance, with Jesus and so forth. So this quote at the bottom will finish up this chart and segue us into what I want to show you about Tantra today. Open-minded beings know that all religious pathways, sincerely followed, can take the soul to blissful oneness. What is known only to the few, however, is that while there are many paths to get to the goal, there is really only one way. For all paths only lead to the foot of the mountain. From there, the intrepid soul, desiring full enlightenment, must conquer the single pitch to the summit. That dizzying ascent to get to the ultimate goal is called renunciation. So if we look at, say, top of my head, Buddha, Jesus, Ramakrishna, you think renunciation first thing, how they renounced the world, how they went away from all things material and all things that had to do with energy and senses and objects, and secluded themselves away from mammon, if you want to put it in Judaism's way of saying it, that you can't worship God and mammon at the same time. So these beings followed these paths. They themselves laid out the foundation for these paths because they had reached the foot of the mountain, knowing that all religions come out of this one reality. Call it God, Brahman, Allah, Yahweh, Pragyaparam, whatever you have in your religion. And then they're going to merge back into them. So doesn't that sound like the earliest Samkhya that Kapila talks about, that all the tattvas come out with all the worlds and all the peoples and all the paths they follow and all the religions and all the philosophies that have come forth. And those are taken back in when one returns to the ocean of consciousness. As we said last week, it's like icebergs forming in an ocean. Then the sun of wisdom rises and melts them all, and they all go back to the ocean. So there's this constant in and out of form, just like your breath again, in breath, held breath, out breath. That's going on all the time, usually beyond the ken of people who aren't thinking about divine reality very often. Like say, how much is very often? Not very often is once a week. So more often would be once a day, but that's probably not going to cut it for sincere seekers of divine reality. They're going to want to have that on their mind all the time, like we saw our teacher, Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj. Peace and bliss be to him. He was always, in every moment of every day, that was his thought, was on Brahman alone. And then he was trying to teach us how to be that way. So this quote then summates everything we've been talking about on this chart of universality, that we see that these people who, like our founder Lex Hixon, did go and follow different paths. He became a citizen in different religious traditions of the world, he himself said. So we saw him with Swami Nikhilananda understanding non-duality in Gaudapada in New York when he was young. And then after that we saw him all starting to enter into interviewing people from different religions. And he'd found certain people that he thought were really good, the best teachers of those particular religions, whether they be Islam, Sufism, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and other great teachers that he came upon and studied with. And pretty soon he was himself beginning to practice under some of these guides. And so he really epitomizes this kind of soul who is actually getting off of the goal of one path and just going right on to the beginning of the next path, as if you would trace a series of paths to get to the foot of the mountain. But then this surprising thing that isn't added very often to Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vedanti is that maybe those paths all lead to just the foot of the mountain, but there's only one way after you get to the foot of the mountain. That's conquering the pitch and moving inward. So I said last week, if you want to get to the top of the mountain, you're going to want to lighten up. So if you're at the foot of the mountain, you have a pack full of things you think you need, and you haven't divested yourself of those things, like religious preferences and sankalpas and good karmas and the things we were talking about here, then you're probably going to want to sit at the foot of the mountain and quintessentialize this. I don't need that, I don't need that, I don't need that, I'll keep this, a little bit of water, a little bit of food. So that's, of course, an neti neti, that is a universal practice of Vedanta. So when I get my pack light enough, then I can make this ascent. Another way of saying that is discrimination, that you're going to need the knowledge that you've gleaned over long time practice, again, maybe decades of practice with a good teacher or teachers. You're going to need that knowledge when you make this ascent, because you've now put everything behind you that was not the goal, including the path, but you found the way, and the way is to divest yourself of everything. So Sri Ramakrishna was the best exemplar of that in this day and age. That's why we look at him and we see Jesus there, and we see Buddha there, we see Shiva there, and so forth. We see Krishna there and Vishnu. his name and his visage and the paths he followed were all of the highest and best that India can offer. So he didn't really need to qualify himself in any of this. He came with it in toto, in possession of it all. And then he demonstrated it to us by ascending this mountain several times a week. See, he would go up and down the amber stairs of birth and death and come back down to see people, and then go back up to the non-dual I again and merge with Brahman, and then come back out of Brahman and come back to the world, until such an extent when he said, Divine Mother has put me in Bhavamukha so that I can see both the world and Brahman as I walk down the middle of these on one path. So this one path that I'm emphasizing over and over again is this one way of renunciation when you find yourself completely divested of cause and effect, and you're very close to the Divine Mother or to your Ishtam. Then at that point you can empty your pack further and make this inner pitch. You see, if you found the mountain, you found the foot of it, that was hard enough to find through the forest. But now you've found yourself there, and you say, in order to need to get to the top where the view's the best, I'm going to have to practice this path of discrimination between the real and the unreal. So, of course, that's the conclusion of which Vedanta comes to. Vedanta, Siddhanta, Niruktir, Esha, the conclusion of Vedanta is that all this is Brahman. So how did they get there to knowing that all this was Brahman? And so then they didn't have to go any further. See? So we know how that's happened now by Samkhya, Yoga, and Vedanta when we looked at those darshanas. So let's look at Tantra and how it shows the way towards this and what it particularly uses. For that, we'll go back to this chart. First of all, let's finish up this chart because we didn't do it in the first class. We can see that this is this two rivers chart, you might say. The two streams that are flowing out, the Vedic stream and the Tantric stream. You remember, so we looked at the first class at the Vedantic stream, the Vedic stream we're calling it. It ran through these three paths of duality, qualified non-dualism, and dualism, which were circulating currents, you might say, in both the Vedantic and Tantric darshanas. But Vedanta began to lean more towards the Jnana Yoga, and then it came up and followed, as we just looked at three last week, the last few weeks, it followed these 6 orthodox darshanas, and they were great lights that came out of the Vedic way of thinking. So if you were in this river of Vedic thinking, and then all of a sudden you found these wonderful treasures in that river. See, so 6 of them would be there. They would come out of this Vedantic way of thinking. So we've looked at that fairly well, and we looked at that the first class some weeks ago. But to look at the Tantric stream on this chart now, it's closer to the Dvaita dualism, like the rich worship and deification. Those are the two things when you think of worship and gods, then you think Tantra. When you think of meditation and formlessness and Brahman, or the absence of all things, including gods and goddesses, you think Vedanta. And so you could, in Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vedanta type of style, you could begin to look at some of these religions, like Sufism and, say, Buddhism. Which way do they lean? Do they lean toward the worship of Tantra, or do they lean toward the non-dual, like Buddhism does, toward the non-dual of Buddha nature and formlessness? And so you begin to see how out of these two great streams that India has been showing for millennia. These great darshanas, or paths of clear seeing, and religions themselves are emerging out of these waters and merging and mingling their waters as they do. In Tantra, if it's going more towards finding out the nature of worship and deifying all things rather than renouncing them, then it will very soon take you to along this path that people take by the millions called Bhakti Yoga. A lot of the religions are given very much to devotion to the Ishtam, as we would call it in our tradition, or to the chosen ideal. And so that's this path of devotion. But you can see there at that juncture, there are 4 different yogas there, which we'll be talking about in a few weeks at the retreat in Oregon that we're going to give, called 4 Yogas Living. So there's those 4 that you see right there. Raja Yoga and Karma Yoga, that is action and inaction, or I should have put that in order, inaction and action, are right there in the middle between those 2 streams. People are meditating either on the formless reality or on God with form. They usually choose one or the other. And then great souls like Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda could come along and show you how, well, to be mature, we do both. We get to the Father through the Son, definitely. We come to know the non-dual Brahman by worshiping God with form in its highest emanation. So you put your mind on God with form, the best form that you can possibly select, to your knowledge and to your experience, and that will lead you naturally to the state of oneness. On either side, then, on the Vedantic side, they proceed a lot through the yoga of wisdom. The Tantric side, again, the yoga of devotion is accented. Now you see, whereas the Vedantic path that you followed through all of that gave rise to the orthodox darshanas in general, the same way with the Tantric path that you followed, that river that you flowed down, as it were, as a sincere aspirant, led you to the 5 main sects. So on 6 darshanas on one side, the 5 main sects on the other. The 5 main sects are all with form. So Shakti, if you follow that path, you're worshiping Divine Mother. If you have your Ishtam as Shiva, then you're a Shaivite, and you worship Shiva. That's, of course, God with form. Vaishnava, they worship Vishnu, and so Krishna, Ram are their ideals. And that's a third one of these 5 main sects of India. And there's also Ganapati. So the Ganapatjas, they worship Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, and seek him for their highest good. He removes the obstacles from their path, takes them to the ultimate goal. And then those worship the sun, Sauryas. The sun not meaning an orb in the sky necessarily, although that's a magnificent thing, physically speaking. But it's the sun of wisdom inside, like the third eye is that. It's this great sun shining on everything. It's very much akin to the Word. And speaking of the Word, all of these, both sides of these streams are very much taken up with the Word and the goddess who propitiates the Word, who presents the Word to people, the Vakdevi, goddess of the Word. So all of these are, in India at least, are very much endeared of bhakti and jnanam, the 2 wings of the bird, and then the head of the bird being meditation, the tail of the bird being karma, or action. So one word, one wing, is devotion of the bird of all of India's teachings, if we use it just metaphorically. And one wing is the wisdom side of things. The head is meditation, and the tail feathers, which guides the boat of your body across this solid earth, as one seer says. All of those comprise this bird of universality, or comprehensive philosophy. True religion rather than irreligion. And it matters not whether you approach it through non-dualism or dualism. or best of all, maybe through qualified non-dualism up the middle. So if you can look up this chart, you can see how all of these get included in this, as best as can be represented through this image of two great rivers flowing all the time side by side. And if you want to call them generally philosophy and religion, you can do that. But in India, they were never sundered apart. They were always taken as one, two expressions of the same reality. So that ushers us back into this tantric side of things, because we looked for 4 weeks now at the left-hand side as we face this. We looked at the Samkhya, we looked at the yoga, and we looked at the Vedanta, and they're all included right here as three of these 6 darshanas. There's yoga and of Patanjali, Samkhya of Kapila, and the what's called the Vedanta of Vedavyasa. So let's look now at what Tantra contributes. So we'll go back to this chart of the Divine Mother's many arms, so that now that we have sort of requalified ourselves intellectually and philosophically about the oneness or not two-ness of all of these great eddies and flows and waves and ripples that have risen out of these two rivers, both of which are flowing into the ocean of consciousness called Brahman. That's the same goal of Vedantists, is the same goal of the Tantricists, whether they're proceeding through wisdom or they're proceeding through devotion or deification of things. They both have the same goal in mind, is this formless reality. That's so unique to India because it's been decided that that's the truth, and they've corroborated each other's teachings in that way. So in that way, it's India that makes this Divine Mother's collection of religion and philosophy, her storehouse of teachings, very precious. And this is why we have to qualify ourselves to understand it. We can just take little echoes we've heard from India, like say, oh, I heard about yoga and then I thought it was just asana, or I heard about Tantra and I thought it was just doing puja once a day, or I heard about Vedanta and all of a sudden I turned a non-dualist overnight. You see, it's not the way it happens unless you already are very close to the goal when you were born in the first place. If you were one of these Jivan Muktas who came out with no karma and just live one lifetime, in return to those beings we pay the highest worship. But otherwise, the qualification process is very important to make yourself prepared and ready to get to non-duality through yoga, Vedanta, or Tantra. It can't be faked, it can't be presumed. It's got to be practiced and realized. So looking back on this chart that I created specifically for these series of classes, and its main quote, which I won't read again because we've read it twice, but you should look at it again, Swami Vivekananda giving us permission to dive into these darshanas and do a deep study of them. And this is how he put it to us when he was alive recently. Then below that you see at the center of all of Mother's arms, which are coming up with these lights, each light being a great darshana or a great religion or a great philosophy, all composed and brought forward by a great divine personality or personage. Then you see that we looked at that unique thing I was just talking about, is that India has had a consensus and drawn a conclusion, a siddhanta, a dindima around the truth of all of these. Hard to put a name to them. Darshanas, passive, clear seeing. You hate to say just philosophy or just religion. You'd want to look for a word that somehow would mean like some of the words in Sanskrit, samanvaya, how to bring it all together into one picture. Like facets of a diamond. Sometimes in India they've taken a picture of a diamond and assigned the different facets to these different religions and philosophies. But the point here being is that they've all concurred with one another, and they've all looked at each other's system over millennia. You can't look in the world anywhere and find that going on. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of one-sidedness in the world's religions. But in India, because I think it had this non-dual basis underneath it all the time, that when it went exploring in the fields of the Lord, it knew that it had come out of this undivided essence, and that was its very self. And that if it kept that in mind as it moved out, then it was safe. And it could return to it, as we were just talking about Samkhya's early teachings. Sancharaha, prati sancharaha, is that I come out from an essence via these steps that I myself created for myself in a prior lifetime. And then I go in by those same steps back to my essence. So this is a conclusion. And it's been conceded, and there's a consensus about it by all of these, that that's what's happened. And we looked at that in terms of Samkhya's contribution, Yoga's contribution, and Vedanta's contribution. Let's look at Tantra now then, see what it adds into this mix, in these 5 bullet points, or 4 maybe. So first, Vedanta, after the Vedanta there, you see Tantra listed. It transforms all beings, objects, and events by deifying them as expressions of divinity. So notice the absence of imperfection, sin, mention of hell, mention of damnation. It's all watering the flowers and not the weeds. The weeds will go away naturally if you just stick to the point. So Tantra is very good at pointing this out because its main emphasis and the impetus it gives to its emphasis has to do with everything being divine. See? Vedanta is also like that it's going to strip away things that you think are real, which aren't absolutely real, and then reveal the truth to you. Tantra is going to deify those very things that you think are real, and then they'll just melt, they'll show themselves up as being part of the real. It's to see the difference there, like 2 different rivers. And different methods of those rivers will help you with this. And this is a matter of what happens after you qualified yourself. You need to understand this very thing first, meditate on it as a fact, see it as a principle, and then follow it as an axiom. And that will be your religion of the age, like putting the 4 yogas together rather than just, oh, I'm a Gyani, oh, I'm a Bhakta, see you later. I'm a Jnana Bhakti and I meditate. But I also have this tail feathers behind me. See them? I'm working, you see. And I'm working to serve others without any desire for the fruits, because Krishna told me to do that. You see, that was the yoga I followed, and he told me to do that. However, Krishna wasn't just a bhakta either, as we know, but he said knowledge is the best purifier. Nahi jnanena sadrisham pavitram iha vidyate tatsvayam yoga samsiddhaha kalenatmani vindate. And you can go on reciting the Gita like that, and you'll keep coming upon these unifying samanvaya mahacharya, these unifying teachings of the great ones that will show you again and again that this was one before an inception. And afterwards, it may have broken into 2, 4, 6, 5 or 6. You see, 2, 4, 5 or 6. But it never left its ground of unity when it did that. You see, this is my particular experience, this is my particular expression of the oneness that my brother religion in another nation is also talking about, and of the person with a different temperament down the street is also talking about. And so then you're not just giving it lip service, this great truth of non-duality, but you're actually practicing it and realizing it. So that's what we mean here about consensus and conclusion. I was thinking how to put all of this under a heading, and that's what I came up with. So the first one of Tantra would be that transforms all beings, objects, and events by deifying them as expressions of divinity. So you would go out with a very, as Vivekananda said, all positivity, no negativity. You'd go out, if you were a tantric practitioner of the ultimate kind, and you'd see everything that happened, negative and positive, as an expression of divinity. And then you could transform, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself here on this list, but you could transform the poison of relativity into the nectar of reality. That's one of the great teachings in Tantra. They transform the poison of relativity, that is, the negative things that are in it. By the way, those negative things sometimes appear positive, but they're actually negative. And that's why Krishna says in the Gita, what's sweet in the beginning will turn sour later if you watch. And what's sour in the beginning might turn sweet later if you practice. So it's not just so cut and dried and easy like that. You're going to have to go and practice it and make it true, make it ring true for yourself. And so that's what we mean by transforming the poison of relativity, relative existence, into the nectar of reality. So anything that happens that's negative, how long is it going to take you to see that as an expression of divinity? When you're doing that, yes, it's rather Vedic and Vedantic, and it's rather yogic. All those will help you, but it's really a tantric precept, because they're proceeding by the process of deification rather than neti-neti or renunciation. Tantra will get to renunciation later, after it's seen everything as Brahman. That's its way of seeing everything as Brahman. Vedanta will start out saying, let's cut this away right now and see it as Brahman immediately. See? And good luck with that. You know, that's why there's so few people taking to Vedanta, because it's a sword. It's a Mother Kali sword you're talking about there. But here Mother Kali herself is tantric. See? So you're going to have to go deep and get some deeper understanding. Let's take the second one, because I can go on and on about this. First one. The second point invokes and awakens all deities as conscious personifications through ritualistic worship. You're going to trip over a few stones in Middle Eastern religion if you try and do that there. So the idea of ritualistic worship, we call it puja. It has to be sincere, and it has to be based on the fact, on this tantric realization that all these deities exist, and they exist inside of you. All the kings of heaven are within you, is one way of putting that. All the gods and goddesses exist in you. When everything disappears at the end of an age, all of these things merge back into Brahman. That's how Holy Mother put it. In the end, deities, they all disappear, and there's only one reality left. And she liked to call that my Mother Kali. So we're back to her again, but this isn't a class on Kali. You can look for a few of those on SRV. So this is invokes and awakens all deities. So how do you do that? So here's where mantra comes up for grabs. Throw mantra up in the air, and you can see the yogis trying to get it. You can see the Vedantas trying to clutch it, and you can see the Tantras wanting it. See, so, because mantra is the one way in which is the best way to deify a thing. So if you are worshiping a god, Shiva, or a goddess, Shakti, or a deity like the elephant-headed god, then there's a mantra for that. And you get that mantra from a practitioner who's well-versed in using it. And you start practicing it, and you start to draw the essence out of the mantra, or the mantra starts to draw the essence out of you. And then you become imbued with the power of Shakti. That's what the mantra gives you. That's she herself in that series of words that you're repeating. So, O meditator, awake, you must, you must. You are the goddess. So the person sitting here worshiping on the goddess is somewhere outside. But where have you ever seen her? You've seen her energy, prana. You've seen expressions or manifestations of her. You've certainly seen that there's plenty of masquerading going on too. Cosmic subterfuge, I call it. See? So you've seen that going on, you've had to filter through that. But what about, oh meditator awake, you are the goddess. She is your very essence. Those are great declarations in the Shakta path. So this is why you begin to see, by this transforming power of things like the mantra, that third eye that opened for the Vedantist and the yogi is the same third eye that's opening for the Tantricist. But they've made it open through different methods. And the methods are what we're trying to qualify ourselves in, so we understand when we see a yogi, or we understand when we see a Rinpoche, or we understand when we see a Lama, or we understand when we see a Roshi, how they've come to their conclusion, and then how these schools have a consensus. And you'll find out that the consensus is best given in India. They're the ones that have been the most successful with the least amount of infighting around their religious lineages and traditions. They can even, probably the only race that's done it very successfully, they can live right next to the Muslims in the same country and accept their religion. So that gives rise to a very beautiful kind of religious hybrid, if you want to call it that works. Like, for instance, the Hindu Muslim who sang this. Jo kucha hai so tu hai tujh se humne dil ko lagaya. Jo kucha hai so से हमने दिल को लगाया, दिल को लगाया. Oh Lord, I have finally seen the truth, that everything exists in Thee. All hearts and minds are united in Thee. There is nothing else but Thee. So this is the combination, a consensus, a conclusion that comes from a person who is born a Hindu but takes on the Muslim religion. That simply and that easily. You'll see them moving around the world, and you'll see them in their dhotis or their saris and various clothing they wear, and you say, well, that's a Hindu. You'll find out, Allahu Akbar, they're actually Muslim in their faith. So this is how this one reality gets into and expresses everything, and that's what Tantra is so good for. When I said water the flowers and not the weeds, it's unfortunate that even if you do that, weeds are going to come. See, any gardener knows that. Some strange variety of weed is coming up. So there are people who are fighting each other and each other's religion all the time, like the Catholics and the Protestants going to war for 400 years in Europe. Same religion, but there they are warring. So it's not just the Christians against the Muslims, it's actually the Christians against other Christians. These are the kind of weeds that are coming out of this lack of conclusion, lack of consensus, and lack of definitive process and practice based on the knowledge of non-duality. If you had the knowledge of non-duality, there would be no problem here. And that's what I'm trying to explain, I hope in not too roundabout way, at the second point of Tantra, that it invokes and awakens all deities as conscious personifications. And it does it through ritualistic worship. Who was it? Gandhi said, I can go into the Hindu temple and worship Krishna. I can go into the Christian church and worship Christ. I can go to the Kaaba and worship Muhammad. So basically he had all of these in his mind. They were all right there in India for him, not to pick and choose from, but to actually see as expressions of divine reality. It's the one indivisible reality that's appearing as these pathways with these many people on them. And you could probably say that Vedanta will take you to that realization in the end. That's where it's the slow path. But Tantra will take you to that right away if you sit down and worship with it, like with the mantra. There's no way you can stay narrow if you've been given the mantra of Sri Ramakrishna. That's what our founder, Lexington, said to me when I was a 20-year-old man. I said, I've been around the world and teaching, singing songs of India to people, sang for my guru and so forth. And people seem to all accept Sri Ramakrishna. Nobody has any problem. And he said, that's because that's universality right there. Sri Ramakrishna is the best expression of that. Nobody can be narrow who hears about Sri Ramakrishna. Nobody can actually step in and say, that's not true. All religions aren't true. Because Sri Ramakrishna has proved that they're all of the same essence. So if you say that in your ignorance, then you're going to get your comeuppance from somebody who knows much higher and much better than you do, who's a follower of a universal path, and who knows and is qualified in all facets of it. That's where faith is beyond mere belief. Faith is the reality without a second. Belief is challenged and flees at the first sign of any kind of different opinion that might surface. The third point here, so we can get deep into Tantra in this class, it utilizes mantra and meditation on God with form to express divine life. That's that further teaching about mantra, but it brings in now that the mantra is connected to the deity. And what were the deities again? Expressions of divine reality, all of them. Each working at their own level of consciousness probably, and maybe we'll look at Kundalini Yoga to see that next week. But nevertheless, all expressions of duality, so of divinity. So basically, that you add in meditation on the name of the Lord, on the form that connects to the name. So Holy Mother said, oh, you must understand, my child, that when Sri Ramakrishna was alive, because she outlived him by a long time, when Sri Ramakrishna was alive, he taught me all the mantras and how they connected to all the deities. So she had people coming from these darshanas and from these yogas and from these sects to her from India, because India had qualified themselves, had lived this many millennia evolution, if you want to call it that, of spiritual paths. All gems strung on a string, as Krishna says. They had lived through that, so they were all coming to her when they found out that the Mother of the Universe was in a body. There's our chance. So they ran to her, and she could give them the mantra connected to the deity that they worshipped the most. But she was also presenting this new deity, this new God called Sri Ramakrishna to them, because he was the one that had seen all the mantras and all the deities. Everyone else was just focusing on one, which, by the way, don't get me wrong, you should be doing. You should be focusing in on one mantra and one deity so you can get the qualification that they have naturally in them when they get into a body on earth. But this is in a little different context. We're saying he saw them all, practiced them all, and then realized them all, and put them all together, he himself said, like a bouquet of different colored flowers. And then he took that bouquet and he offered them at the feet of Mother Kali, which was his Ishtam. And if you look at where was Sri Ramakrishna on this map, that's how we define Sri Ramakrishna. But you probably come down and focus it right about there in Shaktism, and then from there you go to Mother Kali. This is a man that went into bliss when you mention Chaitanya. This is a man that went into non-dual meditation when you mentioned Shiva. This is a man that told you the meaning of the sun when you worshipped Surya. So you couldn't peg him. You couldn't find a place where he would fit in just one thing. But nevertheless, he was the expression of each one of those, fully blown consciousness. That's one of the names of our articles by revered Swami Brahmeshananda Ji Maharaj in India right now, writing for our Nectar Journal. And say this is the blossoming of consciousness, he called it, in Sri Ramakrishna as the subheading. So there are people who are in the know of what a great soul. India has a new God and a new religion. The new God is Sri Ramakrishna, the new religion is the four yogas combined. Right there. Who said that? Swami Vivekananda. Now let's look at the fourth of these tantric points. Idealizes the sanctified relationship of masculine and feminine principles, Shiva and Shakti. And this is really important because that's a real imbalance in this world. And you see it in other religions quite a bit. And you see it, unfortunately, in India too. The women have not been brought to the fore. And this is another quote from Vivekananda. I'm paraphrasing him right now. It's basically, until Shakti is worshipped again in India, there will never be any rejuvenation for India. Because when Swamiji was born in India in the 1800s, he saw all the Dharma disappearing. The English were on the scene with materialism, and then, Christians were on the scene with trying to convert the Hindus because they were weak now at that point. But Sri Ramakrishna was also on the scene with the power of Mother Kali. So Vivekananda saw this situation, and this is how he came to his conclusion and his consensus that he had found and been born in the same city with this great realized soul. This avatar of this yuga was right there in his own neighborhood. And so there he was, in perfect possession of everything he needed to jump the ocean like Hanuman did in an earlier age and land here in England and in America and other countries and give out this good news, if you want to put it that way, of Vedanta that's expressed right there. That we have to balance, bring up the Shakti power and put it together with the Shiva energy. Shiva and Shakti are one. Like how? Can I hear it? I can hear it right now. Like water in its wetness. Like fire in its power to burn. Like a gem in its luster. Like a road and its destination. Shiva and Shakti are one. So this is the fourth point here that we want to look at of Tantra. All very powerful, right? And we can then look back and think about these other bullet points that we looked at in Samkhya, Yoga, and Vedanta and enrich everything with this side of worship of God with form, of deification of all things. And when you read, say, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, it's why I was able to gain interest in qualifying myself in all these paths and darshanas. This is because Sri Ramakrishna was mentioning them every day of his life to the young men who would become his direct disciples, and also to Mahendranath Gupa, who put together the Gospel of Ramakrishna from his own visitations to Sri Ramakrishna at the Dakhineswar Kali temple. So he had put this all together and was expressing it to people all the time. So when you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and you could hear him talking about air, earth, fire, water, and ether, and so forth. Oh, that's the Samkhya he's talking about. A few pages later, he's talking about, or singing a song about Nitai Gaur, and how Chaitanya danced in ecstasy. And so, now he's talking about Vaishnavism. And then a little later, he's talking about, how the path of Neti Neti is for the Gyanis love that path. Then he's talking about Jnana Yoga, and he's talking about Vedanta. And so all of this clicks in you, and you say, well, I've heard all this, and I haven't just heard it and don't know what he's talking about anymore. I've heard it, and now I understand it. I understand where its source is, and I understand how that source is multivariate, is rich with everything that, just a few of the points I'm bringing out here, like fire and its power to burn, or like a word and its meaning would be probably the best of all Shiva Shakti teachings. There's a word and then there's its meaning. You can't separate the two. And it can express itself in hundreds of languages too, and it still remains the same. The words may change, the sound may change, the lettering, the spelling may change, and so forth, but the meaning doesn't change. That stays the same. It maybe even has combined meanings that enhance it. Well, as far as Tantra goes, and that's not as far as it goes, but I wanted to show you one of the teachings of Tantra that comes out. And we look quickly at our qualification chart on this side, then we can make a conclusion to this philosophical part of presenting Tantra. So you see there Swami Vivekananda in the West, and on the right-hand side of the chart in the middle is the box on Tantra. So, I don't know which is simpler now, this chart, which shows you the darshanas and all its points, or just going back to our original chart that is years old, how I looked at this qualification is king kind of teaching. And knowing what Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda knew, culled out the main points of each of these. And we've looked at Vedanta, Samkhya, and yoga already, Patanjala, but let's look at Tantra really quick since it's under the scope right now. Really what they're interested in is Upasana Jnana. So we've heard Vipassana come to us, especially through the form of Buddhism. So that's been something that people are taking to. But we feel like a need, many of the people who have taken to Vipassana come back to the teachers and say, where's the devotion? I'm missing something here. That's Upasana Jnana. Jnana means meditation, so it's time to come back and meditate upon the deities. It's like I tried to jump the steps of all of this and get into some formless enlightenment, and it turned out to be kind of an immature move on my part, that I hadn't qualified myself to know that there's tantric waters in this Vedantic outlook or in this Buddhist perspective. And so I'm feeling a lack of that, so I want to come back to it. So you see there that you come back and you ask for a mantra. See, I want to meditate on a form and have a mantra that reveals the nature of all forms to me. Because then probably I can, if I have attachment to it, then and then only can I transcend form. I couldn't do it before because I hadn't deified form yet. It wasn't a complete practice that I was doing. It wasn't a complete realization that that practice was giving me. So I need to go back and fill in some blanks here. That's the least could be said about it. It's not that Tantra can't stand on its own and give you the full realization. Of course it can do that. Also, there might have been some things missing in my philosophical understanding when I jumped to the highest place, or tried to. And that was how the world manifests itself. It's called Srishti Rahasya in Tantra, the secret of creation, or to use a better word, the secret of projectionism. That's how the mind projects everything. That's really big in Buddhism. But the way Tantra explains it is all the dynamics are there. You don't just look at the world and say, it's unreal and that's all there is to it, and then all of a sudden the next day it begins to snap back on you and look very real to you. But because you haven't yet noticed the source of all projection. That is, you haven't traced the word back to the mind back to the intellect back to the ego back to the witness, and the witness back to the Atman. See? Vacham nyachatmani tam nyacha mudau diyam yacha cha buddhi sakshini. That's what that's called in Sanskrit. Tam chapi purnatmani, the fullness of the Atman, nirvikalpe, the highest state of realization. That's what I get when I do this dissolution. I get vilapya shantim and paramam bhajasva. I get the deepest peace and the most ecstatic bliss when I do this dissolution process. But if I just jump and just give it all away without knowing the dynamics, then I'm going to have to go running back to some teacher eventually and say, I feel something missing in this. I didn't take recourse to all the deities when I went zooming past them on my way up to the highest goal. And they saw me go by and say, he didn't even respect me, you see. Come back here. It's for your own good. Take some provisions. So basically, you deify everything on your way in. The word, you know what that means, you know what words mean. You dissolve those back into the mind. That's where they came from. They didn't come from books or off your tongue only. They came from the goddess of the word, but you have to get there again by stages. And so inward you go and dissolve those two back into the mind, into the intellect, which is now waiting, free of the ego, or waiting to get free of the ego. So then you dissolve that into the ego and the witness. And the witness then looks out and says, there's even a higher place than this. Sakshi Chaitanya, the witness consciousness, will also have to dissolve into that Paramatman, which is Brahman. So, talking about Tantra, I began speaking about Vedanta naturally. But this is how Tantra would put you in the know about how the dynamics, how the world manifested. Because people are out there telling you that it evolved out of nothing. And they're also telling you that matter is real, and it's substantial, and it's fulfilling, and none of that is true. It's only when you know that the world's got projected out of this pure and perfect space and came through the mind, then you know why it has so many imperfections. Because the mind is dual by nature, and consciousness passed through it. It picked those up on its way out and put them into all objects. Like production of products today. People are producing things out of factories from greed. So that greed gets into the object, and then the object doesn't work for you. It decays, it falls apart quickly, and you get all frustrated with it, you see. Or they're so attached to their creations that they wrap them so much you can't get in them anymore. Ever tried to open a pack of batteries without a sharp object? And when you do open it with a sharp object, you have to be careful. So the thing that came, when consciousness came through a mind and picked up all its imperfections, is a part of Srishti Rahasya. It's a part of how everything got manifested out here. And that's why you'll hear the great teachers like Buddha talking about suffering. When he looks at all this, he has one word for it: suffering. And so that's why both Vedanta and Tantra will want you to renounce it. That's that pitch, that one trail leading from the culmination of all religions up the slopes to the top of the Matterhorn. See? With very few fingernail holds on the way and very few rest stops. So you better be very qualified to know how it all came out. So Shishyahasya, we have whole charts on that, and we've done whole retreats on it. So 7 qualifications are there, and that's what I was working towards to end this class. If we want to put a nice exclamation point on the tantric discipline in 1 hour of trying to talk about it, I mean, this is Tantra, as you see over here in our chart, it's not listed as a darshana. That's because it's so ancient and so vast that nobody came along and systematized it. Nobody could do that. It was a great feat that Patanjali came along and systematized yoga into 8 limbs. It was a great feat that Vedavyas came along and put all the remaining Upanishads into 108 and divided them into 4 Vedas. Those were huge feats for great souls. But there wasn't a soul that could do that for Tantra. And so it's just all that vast. And so to understand it, then, we have to go to these teachings that have survived it, and these points that we just looked at that are based upon deification and mantra and divine expression. That's how the Tantrists' eyes see things. A more non-dual eye is seeing all of this as Maya. But where did the concept of Maya come from? And where is it best expressed? In Tantra. So somehow they're borrowing from each other. This is consensus and conclusion. They're borrowing from each other. These waters are mingling themselves, of these 2 rivers, into each other through ages, and proving each other, and also avoiding vying for supremacy, and instead trying to bring things together into a synthesis, integrate them into a path that's going to work for everyone, that all bases are covered in. Again, back to Sri Ramakrishna and his universality. So in the time remaining, then, that's why I brought up this box on Swami Vivekananda's qualification in Tantra and what it means. I mean, the 3 purifications, the 5 moods, and the 8 devotional aids are also there. That's Narada you're talking about there. And but back here to 7 qualifications, there's actually a chart we can show you here, which will allow us to come to know more what a tantric aspirant searches for, and what a tantric teacher looks for in a student. So if the tantric aspirant comes forward, and we should get into this also in terms of Kundalini Yoga next week, that we can look at how a teacher of Kundalini is looking for what has awakened in this person that's coming to them. If nothing's really awakened there, go back to the world, as we heard said, and qualify yourself more in the world, and then come to me when you're ready to know spirituality. So in the same way, tantric teachers are looking for certain things in their acolytes, in their aspirants, in their seekers, in their devotees. And there you see the first one is Daksha, should be intelligent. They're looking for intelligence. Doesn't it sound Vedic or Vedantic? So you can't just, for instance, I'm a tantricist now, and I don't need to read books, I don't need to use words. or any of that. You see, that's not going to wash with actual Tantra. You might want to call it authentic Tantra, even right-hand Tantra they've talked about. Because there's a kind of version of Tantra that, as we know, got rather desecrated throughout India's history. And also Tantric Buddhism ran that problem too in its later period. So, Daksha, are you intelligent? What do you know? So, if you want to put it another way, you came to a Tantric teacher and he said, have you qualified yourself yet? That's what we're doing here, right? Over the last 6 weeks. Have you qualified yourself yet? What do you know about this path? Or are you just coming to me because you've got some sort of hope or some sort of expectation? Or, there's this, you saw somebody else succeed in the path and so you think you can do it. Or, you have high expectations and no experience yet. So, what have you qualified yourself to know about in Tantra? And so, well, I know that I need a mantra, and I know that I have a chosen ideal. So I myself have that experience. Students come. I want to join the path. What's your deity? Let's figure this out. Have you ever thought about it? No. So many of them don't have a deity yet, because Christ didn't work for them because of the condition of fundamentalism in America. So they got alienated, as it were, for whatever reason, by the church. And so now they're looking to the Eastern religions for something that can maybe give them back their religion, a religion that works. And so they're saying, no, I really don't have an ideal. I don't know what my ideal is. I'm just an American or a European. So then you have to help them figure out, well, who do you love? What's your deepest love? Well, maybe it is Jesus. So then we have to find out what Jesus means in Tantra or in Vedanta, because that's a qualifying move there. And many people have said that. When I took to Vedanta for years, then I started to understand Jesus. And I realized that I loved him. And I realized what his teachings meant. They weren't interpolated anymore. They weren't text tortured anymore. Vedanta just told me exactly what he meant when he said that. In the beginning was the word. Or be perfect like their Father in heaven was. Or better yet, birds have nests, foxes have holes. Now I know he's talking about renunciation. That wasn't explained to me before. So Daksha, very important, right there as one of the 7 qualifications. Let's go down the left-hand column. They hope that you would have purity of heart. In Vedanta, that's purity of mind. But you can see on this chart here that we were just in, there's the 3 shutis, you see. So one of those is purity of mind. So Tantra and Vedanta, these 2 rivers, share that hope, or that even that expectation that the being has qualified themselves far enough so their heart is not hardened, their heart is not constrained, their heart is not closed up. They're free of hatred, they're free of violence, and actually that comes soon here. Next is Jitendriya. You know the Indriyas. How would you know what Jitendriya means? Because you studied Samkhya, right? And you found out about the 5 Indriyas. And the other 5 Indriyas, that is, there's senses of action and there's senses of knowledge, 10 of them. And those were 10 of the 24 cosmic principles that Kapila put together for us in the ancient Samkhya system. So you can see how not only are these systems growing and learning together and corroborating each other's teachings, but the Sanskrit that connects them also brings to mind the qualification that you got by studying something under a teacher. I don't know what people are looking for sometimes. Sometimes the Guru is just a Santa Claus to them. And they're just, the path is just a club. The Guru is a Santa Claus. The spiritual path is just a club they're joining, quit later. I never thought of it that way in my teens and 20s when I found out that this was a true religion. But whatever the case may be, they just approach a path and teacher, try it out for a few weeks or a month or even a year and say, okay, that didn't work. So what were they looking for that it didn't work? When these systems have been qualifying and freeing people from bondage for millions of years. For millions of years means as many yugas had to pass by to free souls. Thousands of years in our earth time. So then why wouldn't it work for you? Why did you so easily turn your back and walk away? According to Tantra, that teacher over there is not a Santa Claus. That teacher is a divine expression of Brahman, right? Because we just said that. Should we go back and go through it all again? What Tantra wants to teach you? So the 5 senses, or the 10 senses, they want you to master them. So just like in Samkhya and in yoga, Tantra comes along and says, have you mastered your senses yet? Because if you haven't, you're still attached to objects. You're wasting my time, and I'll be wasting your time. You could better go back to the world and work on your senses. See how the senses with their objects works for you. Or go to a yoga teacher. I'm talking about an 8-limbed yoga teacher here, who would tell you how to take your senses off the objects. It's called pratyahara. And get samadhi of objects. That's a kind of a more tantric run in yoga. Is there, oh, the senses are, evil. You see, the objects are evil. It's mammon, it's maya. And so you come at it with that perspective, but then some other teacher tells you, that's a divine expression of God right there. Why are you looking at it that way? You yourself are coloring that thing, and then you're binding yourself with it by that coloration of your mind. Free your mind of colorations. Uncolor those things. And then color them, recolor them all divine. So the tantricist or the teacher of yoga, 8-limbed real yoga, would be telling you these avenues to go at sense mastery. They're hoping, and I mentioned this back there with Pure of Heart, that you came to them with sarvahimsa. That is, that you're peaceful and nonviolent throughout. Like you don't walk around just being peaceful, of act, but then having violent thoughts in your head. Because that's going to come out eventually. Like a boil will come out of the skin, as Sri Krishna said. So basically what you want to do is be free of violence in thought, word, and deed, all 3. And then master that tendency, and then go to a teacher and said, I got it. Oh, you've got the first yama of yoga? Very good. Good start. You see. Now with nonviolence in hand, you can proceed on the spiritual path. Otherwise, go back to the religions that are warring with one another. Because they'll take you and put you in their army, their religious army, and they'll send you to kill people. That's not real religion, that's irreligion. But it's rife in the worlds, with the countries, with the races, in the Burloka, even in the ancestor realm, even with the gods and goddesses to a certain extent. It's like everyone wants to jump to war as soon as they can. So peaceful and nonviolent, if you want to be a tantricist and deify everything, they're going to see through it if you're violent. Why are you sitting here and worshiping me with an evil mind? Get out of this place. Qualify yourself somehow. Now we have, from going around the circle, or up to the top of the right-hand column, Dvaitahina. They want you to be beyond dualism, Dvaita, and be a non-dualist. Further, they want you to have devotion to the scriptures. So it sounds like the Tantricists are kind of on the side with the Vedantists, because the Vedantists have love of the scriptures. These will purify your mind, Krishna said, this knowledge in them. So the Tantrists might be a little surprised. I thought all I had to do was worship, you see. But you want me to read the scripture? Yeah, try the Narada Bhakti Sutras first. That's a scripture, if it's more to your temperament. But then maybe you want to read something like Yoga Vashishta, which will give you the whole Vedic side of India. So, Astaka, these are called Astaka, I'm sorry, over here that we were looking at. These are darshanas, these 6 are called Astaka. If you wanted to add a little box in here called Nastika, then you would have other runs of Indian thought. Like Buddhism's Nastika. It doesn't take the Upanishads for its highest authority. So they might put it in that category. Not that I particularly agree, but... Now, Brahmanista, Brahmavadi, Brahmaparayana. You should have faith, path, and refuge in God. All 3 of those. Your faith should be in God. Means not the world, not the objects, not relationships, not money. If you want to do all the not, it's in there. So your faith must be in divine reality, however you think of it or call it, which will be beautiful if you have a pure mind and if you've taken refuge and so forth, and you have intelligence, of course, then you're safe. And you also, your path should be in God. No better chart to show than the one that we looked at with all these religions leading to the foot of the mountain and going up to the top. Your path should be there in Brahman, and your refuge should also be there in Brahman. I take refuge in that Brahman whose divine light turns the attention of mankind to the Atman, as the Upanishads say. Jananim Sharanam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadguram Pado Padme Toye Shritva Pranamami Mahor Mahor Pranamami Mahor Mahor Harindras Chestitai Kalagyogayanai Parigyanar Buddho Maharshi Darshanai Yatindro Shakti Bir Bhavanyan Nastikim Vivekananda Te Prabhate Pranjalihi Narendra Shashave Narendra Yavane Narendra Kridane Narendra Shikshane Narendra Palane Narendra Karpane Vivekananda Te Prabhate Pranjali Vivekananda Te Prabhate Pranjali. Hail Vivekananda, all excellences abide in thee. Your heroic actions remind us of Hanuman. Your unrivaled detachment marks you as a supreme renunciate. Your music and poetry blend artistry and heartfelt devotion. Your infinite wisdom reflects the state of a mature Jnani. Profound inner visions mark you as a great Rishi. In this auspicious dawn of illumination, O Vivekananda, we offer you our reverent salutations. May we see with these eyes what is good and spiritual. May we hear with these ears what is noble and uplifting. And may we, while worshiping the Lord and Mother of the universe, with healthy minds and bodies, live a life which is beneficial to ourselves and to all others. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om.